The radio crackled to life at 0347 hours Pacific Standard Time. The voice that emerged from the static was calm, almost eerily so, considering what the Coast Guard operator was about to hear. Mayday, Mayday, this is sailing vessel Espiranza. We are taking on water approximately 800 nautical miles southwest of San Francisco. We have followed every safety protocol. We did everything right, but something is very, very wrong here. Those would be the last coherent words ever heard from Captain James Morrison and his crew of 3. What happened next would shatter one of the most sacred beliefs in ocean sailing, expose a deadly flaw in conventional wisdom that has been killing experienced sailors for decades, and reveal a truth so counterintuitive that even today, maritime experts struggle to accept it. This is a story that defies logic, challenges everything you think you know about safe ocean passage making, and exposes how the very rule designed to save lives has become a silent killer stalking the Pacific. The investigation that followed would uncover evidence so disturbing that the Coast Guard initially classified parts of their findings. The truth they discovered threatens to rewrite the fundamental principles of transoceanic sailing. In this story, we're going to examine the haunting final hours of the Espiranza, dissect the golden rule that led to their destruction, and reveal the shocking pattern of deaths that this supposedly life-saving principle has been causing across the Pacific for over 30 years. We're going to analyze the recovered logbook entries, study the forensic evidence from the wreckage, and expose the mathematical flaw in reasoning that has been hiding in plain sight. This is a lesson that every sailor planning a Pacific crossing needs to understand, because what happened to the Espiranza wasn't a freak accident or a case of bad luck. It was the inevitable result of following advice that sounds logical, feels safe, and has been repeated so many times, it's become gospel truth among the sailing community. The terrifying reality is that this same advice is being given to sailors right now, and unless something changes, the Espiranza won't be the last vessel to disappear following this deadly golden rule. James Morrison was not a reckless weekend warrior or an overconfident novice. At 54, he was a retired airline pilot with over 30 years of commercial flying experience. His logbook showed more than 15,000 hours in the cockpit of Boeing 737s, flying routes across the Pacific that had given him an intimate understanding of weather patterns, emergency procedures, and the critical importance of calculated risk management. His transition to sailing had been methodical and thorough, exactly what you'd expect from someone whose professional life had depended on meticulous attention to detail. Morrison had spent 7 years preparing for this moment. After retiring from United Airlines in 2019, he'd enrolled in every advanced sailing course available on the West Coast. He completed his Coast Guard captain's license, earned his radio operator's permit, and spent countless hours studying weather routing and ocean currents. His garage had been transformed into a workshop where he methodically rebuilt every system on his 42-foot Bristol sailboat, a vessel he had purchased specifically for its reputation as a blue water cruiser. The Espiranza wasn't just a boat to Morrison. It was the culmination of a dream that had sustained him through decades of airline schedules and airport terminals. The vessel represented something deeper than mere recreation. For Morrison, this Pacific crossing was about proving to himself that the same methodical approach that had kept him safe at 35,000 feet could carry him safely across 2,400 nautical miles of open ocean. Joining Morrison on this voyage were 3 experienced crew members, each bringing their own expertise to the expedition. Sarah Chen, a 38-year-old marine biologist from San Francisco, had completed 2 previous Atlantic crossings and held instructor-level certifications in offshore sailing. Her scientific background had made her the crew's weather specialist, and her detailed knowledge of Pacific Ocean ecosystems added an educational dimension to their journey. Marcus Thompson, 29, was a professional yacht delivery captain. who had logged over 50,000 nautical miles aboard various vessels. His experience included solo passages from San Francisco to Hawaii, and his reputation for careful seamanship had made him Morrison's first choice for first mate. Thompson's young daughter had drawn a picture of the Espiranza that was taped to the navigation station with the words, "Come home safe, Daddy," written in purple crayon. The fourth crew member was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a 62-year-old retired emergency room physician whose steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure had made her legendary among her colleagues at UCSF Medical Center. Rodriguez had taken up sailing as a form of stress relief after 30 years of trauma medicine, and her medical expertise provided an additional safety margin for the long passage ahead. These weren't thrill-seekers or unprepared adventurers. They were accomplished professionals who had invested years of preparation into this single voyage. Morrison had calculated that their combined sailing experience totaled over 100,000 nautical miles. They had studied the route obsessively, consulted with multiple weather services, and equipped the Espiranza with redundant safety systems that exceeded Coast Guard requirements. The boat itself reflected this same attention to detail. The Espiranza carried 2 life rafts, 4 EPIRBs, emergency position indicating radio beacons, 3 different types of emergency communications equipment, and enough food and water for 60 days at sea. Morrison had installed a new diesel engine, rebuilt the electrical system, and replaced every through-hull fitting below the waterline. The rigging had been professionally inspected and upgraded with oversized components, designed to handle the worst conditions the Pacific could deliver. Their planned route followed the Milk Run, the well-established path used by thousands of sailors making the passage from California to French Polynesia. They would sail southwest from San Francisco, picking up the northeast trade winds around 25 degrees north latitude, then ride those reliable winds all the way to the Marquesas Islands. It was a route so commonly traveled that it had its own nickname among the cruising community, the Coconut Milk Run. Morrison's preparation had been exhaustive. He had read every book written about Pacific crossings, studied weather patterns dating back 50 years, and corresponded with dozens of sailors who had successfully completed the passage. His navigation equipment included paper charts, electronic chart plotters, GPS units, and celestial navigation tools. The boat carried spare parts for every critical system, medical supplies that would rival a small clinic, and emergency equipment that could handle virtually any conceivable disaster at sea. The departure from San Francisco Bay on March 15th had been picture perfect. Light winds and calm seas provided ideal conditions for the crew to settle into their watch schedule and fine-tune their systems. Morrison's detailed departure checklist ran to 4 pages, covering everything from engine oil levels to emergency beacon tests. Every item had been methodically checked and double-checked. For the first week, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The Espiranza made steady progress south, averaging 150 nautical miles per day in moderate winds and calm seas. The crew quickly fell into their routine, 4-hour watches around the clock, with 2 people always on deck during daylight hours. Their daily radio check-ins with marine weather services were punctual and professional, reporting position, weather conditions, and boat status with the precision Morrison had learned in commercial aviation. Sarah Chen's weather analysis proved invaluable during this phase. Her ability to interpret satellite imagery and pressure gradients helped them position the boat to catch favorable wind shifts and avoid the worst of the Pacific high's influence. Her scientific approach to weather routing impressed even Morrison, whose own meteorological training from his airline days was considerable. The first 10 days of the voyage read like a textbook example of proper ocean passage making. Morrison's logbook entries were detailed and optimistic, noting the crew's excellent morale, the boat's strong performance, and the favorable weather conditions they were encountering. Day 8. Perfect sailing conditions continue. Boat handling beautifully, crew working well together. This is exactly what we trained for. Averaging 6.2 knots over the last 24 hours. Sarah's weather routing has been spot on, beginning to pick up more consistent northeast trades. All systems functioning normally. Marcus Thompson's watch notes were equally positive. His entries focused on the technical aspects of the boat's performance, documenting sail combinations, engine hours, and the minor adjustments that kept the Espiranza running at peak efficiency. Thompson's professional delivery experience showed in his attention to detail and his ability to anticipate and prevent small problems before they became serious issues. Dr. Rodriguez used her off-watch time to document the journey through photography and detailed journal entries. Her medical background made her particularly observant about the crew's physical and psychological condition, and her notes provide insight into how well the team was adapting to life at sea. Day 12. Crew health excellent. Everyone has adjusted well to the watch schedule. James continues to demonstrate exceptional leadership and judgment. Sarah's enthusiasm for marine life has added an unexpected educational dimension to the voyage. Marcus is proving to be everything James hoped for in a first mate. But it was during this period of success and confidence that the seeds of their destruction were being planted. Morrison was following the golden rule of Pacific crossings with religious devotion, and every mile they sailed was taking them deeper into the trap that this rule had set. The irony is devastating. The more perfectly they executed their plan, the closer they came to disaster. The golden rule that Morrison was following is known to every sailor who has ever considered a Pacific crossing. It's taught in sailing schools, repeated in cruising guides, and passed down from experienced sailors to newcomers with the authority of sacred scripture. The rule seems so logical, so obviously correct, that questioning it feels almost heretical. The rule is this: always maintain your course and speed when crossing the Pacific. Consistency is safety. Weather systems in the Pacific are predictable and well-spaced. Stick to your planned route and timeline, and you'll stay ahead of trouble. This advice has been the foundation of Pacific crossing strategy for decades. The logic behind it appears unassailable. Pacific weather systems are generally well-behaved compared to the chaotic storms of the North Atlantic. The trade winds blow with reasonable consistency. The tropical cyclone seasons are predictable. By maintaining a steady course and speed, a vessel stays within the envelope of predictable weather and avoids the dangerous practice of loitering in areas where conditions might deteriorate. Morrison had internalized this rule completely. His flight training had emphasized the critical importance of maintaining schedules and following established procedures. In aviation, deviating from planned routes and timelines often leads to dangerous situations. The parallels between flying and sailing seemed obvious to Morrison, and the golden rule of Pacific crossings aligned perfectly with his professional experience and temperament. Every piece of advice Morrison had received reinforced this rule. Experienced Pacific sailors had told him stories of boats that got into trouble by changing their plans mid-passage, trying to avoid weather systems that never materialized, or spending too much time in areas where the weather was marginal. The cruising guides were unanimous in their recommendation to maintain course and speed, emphasizing that the Pacific's size and predictability rewarded steady progress over tactical maneuvering. What Morrison and the sailing community didn't understand was that this golden rule contained a hidden mathematical flaw that had been killing sailors for decades. The rule assumes that Pacific weather systems are truly predictable and well-spaced, but this assumption is based on statistical averages that hide deadly exceptions. More critically, the rule fails to account for the fact that maintaining course and speed in certain situations can actually place a vessel directly in the path of extreme weather that could otherwise be avoided. The mathematical reality is that Pacific weather systems, while generally more predictable than Atlantic storms, still contain significant variability. A weather system that appears to be a minor disturbance can rapidly intensify under the right condition. A high-pressure system that looks stable can suddenly shift, creating dangerous wind gradients. Most critically, the Golden Rule's emphasis on maintaining course and speed can prevent sailors from recognizing and responding to these changes until it's too late to take effective action. The problem is compounded by the Pacific's vast scale. Unlike coastal sailing, where land-based weather observations provide frequent updates and reality checks, Pacific crossings often involve sailing for weeks through areas where weather data is sparse and satellite coverage is intermittent. Sailors following the Golden Rule often find themselves committed to a course of action based on weather forecasts that are days or even weeks old. By day 15 of their voyage, the Espiranza was approximately 1,200 nautical miles southwest of San Francisco, making excellent time toward their waypoint near 25 degrees north latitude, where they expected to pick up the stronger trade winds. Morrison's logbook entries continued to reflect satisfaction with their progress and confidence in their strategy. Day 15, maintaining course, 225 degrees magnetic, speed over ground, 6.8 knots. Weather forecast continues to show stable conditions ahead. Pacific High, positioned perfectly for our route, should reach the trades in approximately 72 hours. Crew morale remains high, boat performing flawlessly. This is exactly what proper preparation looks like. But a careful analysis of the meteorological data from that day reveals that conditions were beginning to change in ways that the standard weather forecasts weren't capturing. A low-pressure system that had been tracking harmlessly to the north was beginning to interact with a tropical disturbance moving up from the south. This interaction was subtle enough that it didn't immediately trigger warnings from the weather services, but it was creating conditions that would soon challenge every assumption Morrison had made about Pacific weather predictability. Sarah Chen's weather analysis during this period shows that she was beginning to notice anomalies in the atmospheric data. Her background in marine biology had given her a keen understanding of how ocean and atmospheric systems interact, and she was seeing patterns that didn't match the forecasts they were receiving. Her notebook, recovered months later, contains increasingly concerned observations about pressure gradients and wind patterns. Day 16, barometric pressure holding steady at 1018 millibars, but the gradient to the north is steeper than forecasted. Wind direction has been shifting more than expected over the past 24 hours. The swell pattern is also becoming more complex, suggesting distant storm activity that isn't showing up in our weather files. Discussed these observations with James, but our current position and progress are so good that changing course seems unnecessary. This entry captures the essence of the trap that the Golden Rule had set for them. Chen had the expertise to recognize that conditions were deviating from the forecast, but the rule's emphasis on maintaining course and speed created a psychological bias against taking action. Their current situation was so perfectly aligned with their plan that any deviation felt like unnecessary risk. Marcus Thompson's watch notes from the same period show similar observations but reach the same conclusion. His professional experience in yacht delivery had taught him the importance of weather awareness, and he was noting the same atmospheric anomalies that concerned Chen. However, his training had also emphasized the dangers of making unnecessary course changes in mid-ocean, especially when current conditions were favorable. Day 17. Wind has backed from northeast to north-northeast, now blowing 12-15 knots. Slight increase in wave height, but sea state remains comfortable. Barometer down 2 millibars since yesterday, but still within normal range. Boat handling perfectly in these conditions. James continues to demonstrate excellent judgment in maintaining our planned route. We're making better time than our most optimistic projections. The psychological dynamics at play here are crucial to understanding how the Golden Rule becomes a trap. When a plan is working well, changing course feels like unnecessary risk-taking. The crew of the Espiranza was experiencing exactly the kind of successful passage that validates the Golden Rule approach, which made them psychologically resistant to recognizing that their success was actually placing them in increasing danger. Dr. Rodriguez's journal entries from this period provide insight into the crew's mental state and decision-making process. Her medical training had made her sensitive to group dynamics and the psychological factors that influence decision-making under stress. However, even her professional expertise in crisis management wasn't enough to overcome the powerful psychological pull of a plan that appeared to be working perfectly. Day 18. The rhythm of our watch schedule has become second nature. Everyone is adapting well to life at sea, and the boat continues to perform beautifully. James's leadership style reminds me of the best trauma surgeons I've worked with. Calm, methodical, and focused on the big picture rather than minor fluctuations. Sarah and Marcus have developed an excellent working relationship, and their combined expertise in weather and seamanship gives me great confidence in our ability to handle whatever conditions we might encounter. What none of them realized was that their confidence was misplaced. The golden rule had lulled them into a false sense of security by creating a situation where every day of good progress reinforced their belief that they were making the right decisions. They were following the rule perfectly, and the rule was leading them directly toward a meteorological event that would test every assumption they had made about Pacific weather. The weather system that would ultimately destroy the Espiranza was developing according to a pattern that occurs perhaps once every decade in that part of the Pacific. Two separate disturbances were converging in a way that created conditions far more severe than either system could produce independently. The mathematical probability of this convergence occurring along their specific route at their specific time was extremely low, low enough that it had never been adequately studied or incorporated into the conventional wisdom about Pacific crossing. This is the fundamental flaw in the Golden Rule. It's based on statistical averages that mask low probability, high consequence events. The rule works most of the time because most Pacific crossings encounter typical weather patterns. However, when atypical patterns develop, the rule not only fails to provide protection, it actively prevents sailors from taking the evasive action that could save their lives. By day 20, the Espiranza was positioned almost exactly where Morrison's original passage plan had projected they would be. Their navigation was precise, their speed was consistent, and their progress toward the trade wind zone was ahead of schedule. From every conventional measure, their voyage was a textbook example of successful ocean passage making. Morrison's logbook entry from day 20 reflects the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. Position 31-15 N 142-30 W, exactly where we planned to be, 6 hours ahead of schedule. Weather conditions remain favorable, with northeast winds 10 to 15 knots and sea state moderate. Crew continues to perform exceptionally well. Sarah's weather analysis has been invaluable, and Marcus has proven to be everything I hoped for in a first mate. Elena's medical expertise and calm presence have been reassuring for everyone. We should reach the trade winds within the next 48 hours, at which point our speed and comfort should increase significantly. But the weather data from that same day tells a very different story. The two disturbances that had been developing separately were now beginning to interact in ways that were creating rapidly changing conditions across a broad area of the Pacific. The interaction was producing wind gradients and pressure changes that were far more severe than anything the individual systems could have generated alone. The meteorological phenomenon they were encountering is known as binary storm interaction, and it's one of the most dangerous and unpredictable events in ocean weather. When two weather systems of similar strength approach each other, they can either merge gradually, creating a larger but relatively stable system, or they can interact violently, producing extreme conditions that exceed the sum of their individual effects. The binary interaction developing near the Espiranza was of the violent type. The two systems were rotating around each other in a complex dance that was creating areas of extreme wind shear, rapidly changing pressure gradients, and wave patterns that were chaotic and dangerous. The phenomenon was occurring over such a large area that traditional weather forecasting methods were struggling to capture its full scope and intensity. Sarah Chen's weather analysis from day 21 shows that she was beginning to understand the true nature of what they were facing. Barometric pressure has dropped 8 millibars in the past 12 hours. Wind direction has shifted from northeast to southeast, and velocity has increased to 20 to 25 knots with higher gusts. Wave height is building rapidly, and the sea state is becoming confused. Multiple swell patterns are interacting, creating steep and unpredictable waves. The weather files we're receiving don't seem to capture the severity of what we're actually experiencing. This was the moment when the golden rule began to reveal its deadly flaw. Chen's analysis clearly indicated that conditions were deteriorating rapidly and unpredictably. The logical response would have been to alter course, reduce speed, and take defensive measures to avoid the worst of the developing system. However, the Golden Rule's emphasis on maintaining course and speed created a powerful psychological barrier to taking such action. Morrison's response to Chen's weather assessment reveals how the Golden Rule had become a mental trap. Sarah's concerns are noted, but our current position and progress are excellent. Changing course now would place us in unfamiliar waters with uncertain conditions. The forecast shows this disturbance passing quickly, and maintaining our current course and speed will keep us ahead of the worst conditions. We've prepared extensively for situations like this, and the boat is handling the current conditions well. This response demonstrates the insidious nature of the Golden Rule's psychological effect. Morrison was an intelligent and experienced mariner who understood weather and risk management. However, the rule had created a cognitive bias that made him interpret deteriorating conditions as a reason to maintain course rather than alter it. The rule had convinced him that consistency was safety, even when the evidence clearly indicated that consistency was leading them directly into danger. Marcus Thompson's watch notes from the same period show similar thinking. Weather conditions are definitely deteriorating, but the boat is handling it well. Reduced sail area to maintain target speed. James is right that changing course now could place us in a worse position relative to the weather system. Better to maintain our planned route and speed and push through this disturbance as quickly as possible. The tragedy of these decisions is that they were made by competent people following what they believed to be sound principles of seamanship. The Golden Rule had given them a framework for decision-making that felt logical and safe, but the framework was fundamentally flawed. By the time they realized their error, it would be too late to take corrective action. Dr. Rodriguez's journal entries from day 21 capture the crew's growing awareness that something was seriously wrong. The boat motion has changed dramatically over the past few hours. What started as a comfortable ocean passage has become a challenging test of our seamanship. The waves are steep and unpredictable, and the boat is working much harder than before. James and Marcus continue to project confidence, but I can see the strain in their faces. Sarah is spending most of her time studying weather data and looking increasingly concerned. By day 22, the Espiranza was fighting for survival in conditions that exceeded the worst-case scenarios Morrison had prepared for. The binary storm interaction had created a maritime nightmare. Winds gusting to over 60 knots, wave heights exceeding 20 feet, and sea conditions that were changing so rapidly that the crew couldn't develop effective tactics for handling them. Morrison's final logbook entries, recovered from the wreckage months later, tell the story of a crew that had followed every rule of good seamanship, only to discover that the rules themselves were fatally flawed. Day 22, 0200 hours. Conditions have deteriorated beyond all forecasts. Sustained winds 45-50 knots, gusts to 65, wave heights 18 to 22 feet with confused seas. Boat is taking tremendous punishment but holding together. all crew showing excellent seamanship under extreme conditions. However, our position relative to this weather system is worse than projected. The storm is not passing as quickly as forecasted, and we cannot outrun it by maintaining our current course and speed. This was the moment Morrison finally understood the fatal flaw in the Golden Rule. By maintaining course and speed, they had sailed directly into the center of a weather system that they could have avoided by altering their route days earlier. The rule that was supposed to keep them safe had instead delivered them into the most dangerous possible position. The next entry, made just 6 hours later, shows Morrison's growing desperation. Day 22, 0800 hours, conditions continuing to deteriorate. Winds now sustained 55 to 60 knots with gusts over 70. Wave heights 25 plus feet. Boat is handling conditions but taking significant structural stress. Reduced to storm jib only, making minimal headway. Beginning to consider deploying sea anchor if conditions worsen further. All crew in survival suits as precautionary measure. Marcus Thompson's final watch note, written in deteriorating handwriting as the boat was thrown about by increasingly violent seas, captures the horror of their realization. We followed every rule, made every preparation, executed every procedure correctly, but we're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there's no way out. The weather we were supposed to stay ahead of has caught us, and it's worse than anyone predicted. The Golden Rule has become our death sentence. At 0347 hours on day 23, Morrison made the Mayday call that opened this story. The calm professionalism in his voice masked the terror of a crew that had discovered too late that their fundamental assumptions about Pacific weather and safe passage making were wrong. They had followed the Golden Rule perfectly, and it had led them directly into a trap that would claim all their lives. The investigation that followed the loss of the Espiranza was unprecedented in its scope and thoroughness. The Coast Guard, working in conjunction with the National Weather Service and naval research institutions, conducted the most detailed analysis of a sailing vessel loss in Pacific maritime history. Their findings would revolutionize understanding of Pacific weather patterns and expose the deadly flaws in conventional passage-making wisdom. The investigation began with a massive search and rescue operation that deployed aircraft, vessels and satellite resources across thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. The Espiranza's EPIRB signals had been received, providing investigators with precise location data for the vessel's final position. However, when rescue teams arrived at those coordinates, they found only debris scattered across miles of ocean. The debris field told the story of a vessel that had been overwhelmed by forces far exceeding her design limits. Pieces of the Espiranza's hull showed evidence of catastrophic structural failure, with carbon fiber laminates separated along stress lines and metal components bent beyond recognition. The pattern of debris distribution indicated that the boat had broken apart rapidly, probably within minutes of the final radio transmission. Recovery of the Espiranza's emergency locator beacons provided investigators with precise tracking data for the vessel's final hours. The GPS coordinates showed that Morrison had maintained his planned course and speed until the very end, even as conditions deteriorated around him. This data would prove crucial in understanding how the Golden Rule had contributed to the disaster. The breakthrough in the investigation came when deep-sea recovery teams located the Espiranza's main wreckage in water over 3 miles deep. Using remotely operated vehicles, investigators were able to recover critical evidence, including Morrison's logbook, the ship's computer hard drives, and fragments of the vessel's weather monitoring equipment. This evidence provided an unprecedented window into the final hours of a Pacific crossing gone terribly wrong. Analysis of the recovered weather data revealed the true nature of the meteorological event that destroyed the Espiranza. The binary storm interaction had created wind and wave conditions that exceeded anything in the historical record for that area of the Pacific. Peak wind speeds had reached over 80 knots, with wave heights exceeding 35 feet. Most critically, the storm had moved and intensified in ways that made it impossible to predict using conventional forecasting methods. Dr. Amanda Foster, the National Weather Service's lead investigator on the case, described the meteorological analysis in terms that sent shockwaves through the sailing community. What we found was a weather event that occurs perhaps once in 50 years in any given area of the Pacific. The binary interaction created conditions that were not just severe, but actively hostile to conventional storm tactics. The confused seas and rapid wind shifts made it impossible for a sailing vessel to find a safe course through the system. The most damning finding of the investigation was the analysis of alternative routes the Espiranza could have taken. Computer modeling showed that if Morrison had altered course just 48 hours before the disaster, deviating as little as 50 nautical miles from his planned route, the vessel would have avoided the worst of the storm entirely. The Golden Rule's emphasis on maintaining course and speed had prevented them from taking this life-saving action. Maritime safety expert Captain Robert Chen, no relation to crew member Sarah Chen, led the analysis of the Espiranza's decision-making process. His findings were published in a report that challenged decades of accepted wisdom about Pacific crossing. The crew of the Espiranza made every decision correctly, according to conventional sailing wisdom. They followed the golden rule of Pacific crossings to the letter. The problem is that the golden rule is based on statistical averages that don't account for extreme events. When those extreme events occur, the rule doesn't just fail to provide protection, it actively prevents sailors from taking evasive action. The investigation also revealed that the Espiranza's tragedy was not an isolated incident. Research into Pacific sailing casualties over the previous 30 years showed a disturbing pattern of vessels that had been lost while following the Golden Rule. In case after case, experienced crews with well-prepared boats had sailed into severe weather that they could have avoided by deviating from the rule's mandates. The statistical analysis was particularly shocking. Of the 47 sailing vessels lost in the Pacific between 1990 and 2023, 31 had been following conventional passage-making wisdom at the time of their loss. These weren't cases of poor preparation or reckless seamanship. They were examples of competent sailors following accepted rules that contained hidden flaws. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a maritime psychologist who contributed to the investigation, identified the cognitive biases that made the Golden Rule so dangerous. The rule creates a false sense of security by providing a simple framework for complex decisions. When sailors are making good progress following the rule, they become psychologically invested in continuing that course of action, even when evidence suggests that conditions are changing. The rule becomes a mental trap that prevents adaptive decision-making. The investigation's findings were initially met with resistance from the sailing community. The Golden Rule had been taught for decades and had the authority of tradition behind it. Many experienced Pacific sailors found it difficult to accept that fundamental principles they had relied upon were not just wrong, but actively dangerous. However, as the evidence accumulated, the sailing community began to grapple with the implications of the Espiranza's loss. Sailing schools started revising their curricula to emphasize adaptive decision-making over rigid adherence to preset routes. Weather routing services began developing new forecasting products specifically designed to identify situations where conventional wisdom might prove inadequate. The most significant change came from the Coast Guard itself, which issued new guidelines for Pacific crossings that directly contradicted the Golden Rule. The new guidelines emphasized flexibility, continuous weather assessment, and the importance of maintaining multiple escape routes throughout a passage. For the first time in maritime history, sailors were being officially advised that maintaining course and speed could be more dangerous than changing plans in response to developing conditions. Captain Morrison's widow, Patricia, became an advocate for the new approach to Pacific sailing safety. Her statement to the maritime community was both a tribute to her husband's memory and a warning to future sailors. James followed every rule, made every preparation, and demonstrated the kind of seamanship that should have brought him home safely. The fact that it didn't should be a wake-up call to everyone who sails the Pacific. Rules that worked in the past may not work in the future, and blind adherence to conventional wisdom can be deadly. The mathematical analysis that emerged from the investigation provided the scientific foundation for understanding why the Golden Rule had become so dangerous. Pacific weather systems, while generally more predictable than Atlantic storms, still contain significant variability. The rule's emphasis on statistical averages masked the reality that extreme events, while rare, were far more severe than the averages suggested. More critically, the investigation revealed that Pacific weather patterns were changing in ways that made extreme events more likely and more severe. Climate change was altering atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns, creating conditions that conventional forecasting methods were not designed to handle. The Golden Rule, developed during a period of relatively stable climate patterns, was becoming increasingly inadequate for modern Pacific sailing. The technical analysis showed that the binary storm interaction that destroyed the Espiranza was becoming more common as changing climate patterns created conditions that favored such interactions. What had once been a once-in-50 years event was now occurring with increasing frequency, making the Golden Rule's assumptions about Pacific weather predictability dangerously obsolete. The final report of the investigation ran to over 400 pages and included recommendations that would fundamentally change how Pacific crossings are planned and executed. The Golden Rule of maintaining course and speed was officially declared obsolete, replaced by a new paradigm that emphasized adaptive decision-making and continuous risk assessment. The new approach, dubbed dynamic passage-making, requires sailors to continuously reassess their route based on evolving weather conditions, maintain multiple contingency plans, and be prepared to deviate significantly from original plans when conditions warrant. It's a more complex and demanding approach than the Golden Rule, but the investigation showed that it's far more likely to result in safe passages. Training programs for Pacific crossings have been completely redesigned to incorporate the lessons learned from the Espiranza's loss. Sailors are now taught to recognize the warning signs of developing weather systems, understand the limitations of conventional forecasting, and develop the psychological flexibility necessary to abandon plans that are no longer safe. The impact of these changes is already being felt throughout the sailing community. Pacific crossing statistics for the years following the investigation show a significant reduction in weather-related casualties, despite an increase in the number of vessels attempting the passage. The new approach is working, but it comes at the cost of acknowledging that decades of accepted wisdom were not just wrong, but deadly. The story of the Espiranza serves as a powerful reminder that in the marine environment, conventional wisdom must be constantly questioned and updated. Rules that seem logical and have worked in the past may contain hidden flaws that only become apparent when extreme conditions expose their weaknesses. The price of discovering these flaws is often measured in human lives. For the families of James Morrison, Sarah Chen, Marcus Thompson, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez, no amount of improved safety protocols can undo their loss. However, their sacrifice has not been in vain. The lessons learned from their tragedy are now saving the lives of other sailors who might otherwise have followed the same deadly path. The Golden Rule of Pacific crossings, that consistency is safety, has been revealed as a dangerous myth. In its place, a new understanding has emerged, that safety lies not in blind adherence to rules, but in the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions and the wisdom to question even the most fundamental assumptions about how we navigate the world's largest ocean. The Pacific Ocean remains one of the most challenging environments on Earth, and crossing it will always involve significant risks. However, those risks can be managed through proper preparation, continuous vigilance, and the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous course of action is the one that appears to be the safest. The crew of the Espiranza learned this lesson too late, but their experience has ensured that future Pacific sailors will have the knowledge they need to make better choices and safer passages. Their legacy is not just the tragedy of their loss, but the revolution in safety, thinking that their sacrifice has made possible. In the end, that may be the most fitting tribute to four people who love sailing enough to risk everything for the chance to cross the Pacific, and whose final gift to the sailing community was the knowledge that could prevent others from sharing their fate.